You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Mike.
Great to see you, Kate.
Jeff is still away. Is he beefing with one of us? Like, what's going on?
He's on some kind of lefty journey to the heart of darkness.
Okay. We know he's okay, though. We've heard from him, and he'll be joining us soon. Yeah.
Yeah, he's been leaving coded messages at Karl Marx statues all over Eastern Canada. So we've got the signal. He's good.
Okay. He's good. Okay, great. Well, we'll be joined today in Strategy Suite by one of Jeff's fellow visionistas, who also has the distinction of being from Mike's hometown. Perhaps that's the big reason he's here, Mike. Yeah, I know you
That's
love our
right.
hometown team.
I'm a homer.
Yeah, you're a homer. All right. Our guest today is going to take us further afield to the old country. Andrew Percy is the outgoing Member of Parliament for Brigg and Goole in Yorkshire. Since 2010, he has been a Conservative MP, winning re-election in a marginal seat 3 times. During his time as MP, he served through a minority parliament twice, Brexit, Boris Johnson, and the aftermath of Boris, we'll call it. His riding was redistricted out of existence, which is totally fine by him. And he had laid plans to retire from Parliament at the ripe old age of 46 and move to Canada. And in fact, there are a few people on this planet who know more about Canadian politics than Andrew Percy. Andrew, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for reminding me of the trauma of the last 14 years.
Well, can you tell us a bit about that trauma? Like, how did you end up signing up for that? You were first elected at the age of barely 30, early 30s?
Yeah, I mean, I still officially claim to be 35, but yeah, I was quite young when I was elected. I'd been on the city council, but of course, I took over this seat, which had the same Labour MP for the whole of the Blair years, and during his time, of course, apart from the Iraq War, everything went smoothly. They had big majorities. Economies were going quite well in the West. Everything was relatively calm. I get elected, and then we have Scottish independence referendum, the coalition, Brexit referendum, the Brexit tribulations, the 2017 election that wasn't what we thought it would be, Jeremy Corbyn, anti-Semitism, and then COVID, and then a lot of prime ministers. I think I've lost count. So I feel a bit. You forgot
about Brexit. Did you say Brexit? That was a big one.
I said Brexit. Yeah, we had Brexit, and then we had all the travails of that for a couple of years.
Right.
So, so I feel like I got the kind of fluffy end of the lollipop compared to my predecessor, who kind of had 13 years of relative peace in this constituency. So, but anyway, it's all been fun.
Well, we have you on today because you're in Canada a lot, and I've met you here in Vancouver, and I've been impressed by your knowledge of Canadian politics and your, frankly, obsession with it. Why are you so interested in Canada?
Good question. I got really interested in Canada when I met some relatives when I was about 7. They came over from Canada. They gave me this book of Canada, and I had all pictures of all the provinces and territories, and I was just kind of obsessed with it from a really young age. And then I always wanted to visit. And then when I was 17, I took myself off on my own with a backpack and backpacked up using Greyhound buses to the Yukon, and then all the way across the Yukon, bits of BC, and just was kind of really, really interested in Canada, just the open spaces, the history, the kind of shared history. And then I was always interested in politics, got interested in Canadian politics. I actually did my dissertation at university on Canadian national unity, because it was just after a couple of years after the 95 referendum. So, and then I've just kind of followed it. I'm the guy who stays up here until 3 or 4 in the morning to watch the CBC coverage of the PEI provincial elections, where people win with fewer votes than I used to win.
Nobody does that in Canada.
That is amazing.
I know nobody does that in Canada, but that's how geeky I am about Canadian politics, weirdly. So sometimes I meet Canadians who try to tell me about Canadian politics, and then I kind of have to do that eye roll of like, I'll go through this for 20 minutes, and then I'll explain how I know more about Canadian politics than they do.
Is your political is your political fascination like, is this a like constitutional monarchy thing, or like do you also follow US politics closely?
I kind of follow US politics a bit, but I prefer Canadian politics. I mean, I follow Australia and New Zealand politics a bit as well, because I find the whole Westminster system stuff interesting. I don't follow anything as closely as I follow Canadian politics, but I just have always been interested in the country, the history of the country, and and that's why I did my dissertation on the subject of Canadian national unity. I found the whole national unity debate really interesting when I was when I was quite young, when I was a student. So I think it's a similar system, right? And it's the same system in so many ways. And I think that's what's interesting for a political geek like me.
It's
Well,
interesting because
yeah, I was going to say sometimes you need perspective, right, from outside of Canada to understand what exactly is happening in Canada. Like de Tocqueville did his famous tour of the United States many hundreds of years ago. So what do you like? What's your take on Canada today from afar? What is the
Well, I mean, look, I had the Angus Reid Institute into Parliament a few months ago, and the first question I asked them was, why are the Tories 20 points ahead in Canada, and why are the Tories 20 points behind in the UK? And the issues were largely the same, but the difference was that we're not in government in Canada, we are in government here. So you take away a lot of the things are the same challenges, right? Housing policy. The whole issues of cost of living and all the rest of it that we've had in recent years are fairly similar with all the pressures we've had as a result of COVID and as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So the issues are quite similar. I mean, obviously, I'm no fan of Trudeau, so I'm not going to say anything nice about him. But the issues are fairly similar. I mean, the issue at the moment, I'm very involved in Middle East stuff as well. I think I've been quite surprised at how bad some of the stuff in Canada has been on that issue, actually, which I think has diverged a little bit from us here. But ordinarily, the issues are fairly similar, right? They're, same nonsense, different city, to make the phrase a bit politer.
Can we contrast the Conservative leaders for a second? And I want to talk about, like Pierre Poilievre federally, and then it's Prime Minister Sunak, who I'm trying to, like, how long has he been Prime Minister for? Not that long. Like,
I think a couple of years now.
Like 2 years.
We've had so many, I can't remember.
I know it moved quickly.
Yeah, we've had a lot, and one for not a very long time. I think she was 40 something days.
Yeah, Teresa.
Liz
Liz.
Truss.
Liz Truss. Yeah.
I mean, they do all merge into one when they move so quickly. I mean, look, so we've had and I still can't understand why some of them ever became leader. But anyway, that's a trauma I'll process in the coming months and years. But we've had Rishi now and I backed Rishi because I obviously wasn't a big fan of Liz Truss's program. So we've had him 2-3 years, whatever it is now. And look, he's just, the contrast between him and Poilievre couldn't be greater, right? Pierre Poilievre is at the height of his power, height of his influence and control over his own party. He's riding high in the polls. You've got a very disciplined message and a disciplined party and team behind him, it seems. Whereas, of course, because we've had so many people who've rotated into government, people who frankly should never have been brought into government, who then got rotated out by another leader, another prime minister. So you have all these unhappy ministers and all these people who belong to different camps. There's the Boris lot who hate the Rishi lot, and then there's the Liz lot who hate the Rishi lot, and then there's the Rishi lot and it's all these different tribes. I mean, I always say the Conservative Party here were a group of people who occasionally agree with each other, and nothing could be truer than that at the moment. And that's, I think, the big contrast, right? Rishi has taken over a party that has just really significant issues on discipline and understanding that you divided parties don't win elections.
Yeah, so Poilievre here has made a move to kind of neutralize Maxime Bernier on the right and kind of reintegrate that element back into the Conservative Party of Canada, whereas your leader, Sunak, is now has a new front opening up in the middle of a RIP period with Nigel Farage. And is it the Reform Party they're called now?
Yeah, the Reform Party. And Nigel likes to make lots of references to his desire to do to the British Tories what Reform did to the Canadian Tories in '93. So I think even the choice of name was deliberate. So there's
a specific Canadian reference, like they're actually making that reference in the UK to Reform Party of Canada.
That has it. It's Nigel Farage himself, I think, has made it. The newspapers have made it quite regularly. That are the Tories headed for a '93 Canada style wipeout. And the issue is the same, right? A divided right-wing vote. I mean, you know this in BC better than most, right? Divided right-wing votes don't tend to do leave you in government or leave you with a lot of members of parliament or MLAs. But the challenge we have, of course, which I suppose Pierre Poilievre doesn't have, is we're in government. So it's much harder to give. I mean, the big issue we've had here has been this issue of small boats and the migrants coming across the channel on these small boats from France. And, the whole stop the boats thing has become quite a totemic issue. The Prime Minister stood on a platform a year or so ago with we'll stop the boats. And that's easier said than done, right? So, of course, Nigel Farage can say, well, we'll just turn them back, or we'll just sort it out. And people go, yeah, you just need to turn them back. Well, turning back boats of migrants in the world's busiest shipping lane, who are in small inflatable crafts, to France, who are not going to facilitate receiving them, is a little bit more complicated, right? And that's why it's very hard for us to unite the right on this issue of immigration and asylum at the moment, because, and we had the Rwanda policy, we've got the legislation through, but the courts are very activist on this. So
the Rwanda policy, and that, can you just break that down quickly, what that was?
Yeah, so the Rwanda policy, which actually, got a lot of criticism, which is this idea of offshore processing for people who arrive through an illegal route seeking asylum. So we've got legal routes. Obviously, we've had I think a couple of hundred Ukrainians come, if not more, and obviously the Hong Kong route as well. But if you come illegally, you would be processed in Rwanda. That's the deal we did with Rwanda. Now, these are people, of course, who have traveled across many safe European countries already, through France, through Germany, from Spain, from Italy, well, Italy really, and have already crossed through these countries and then choose to get to France and take a small boat to the UK to claim asylum. So it would be only people who arrive illegally. The idea being that, it puts people off making that journey because they'd be processed in Rwanda. Actually, now I think Austria and Denmark are looking at similar things, because this is this huge issue in Europe of migration, right? That's why the far right has just done so well in the EU elections. So we were going to process them off in Rwanda, but it went to the Supreme Court. They struck down effectively what we were planning to do. We've had to put new legislation through. So all of this just means we haven't been able to really tackle the small boats issue.
How similar does the discussion around immigration in Canada feel to the one that's happening in the UK now? And I'm thinking in particular of the fact that, the numbers of folks refugees we have coming across the border. I mean, predominantly you're talking about a Quebec issue, right? And walking across. And then, and if I think of where immigration's been in the headlines, a lot of it has to do actually with international students. I'm sort of setting you up, like, is there a different discussion in these two countries?
No, so we've also through legal migration had record numbers. I think it was 650,000 last year. It's come down this year, and international students have been a part of it, because international students have been allowed to bring family members and all the rest of it. So that's inflated the numbers. So we've had that debate around that, but it kind of becomes, the two become merged, right, in the minds of a lot of people. It's all just too much immigration, whether it's the legal routes, an actual proper immigration, or it's the illegal migration. And I think that there's a difference there from, you've been having numbers coming across on that road in Quebec, which I think there's some action has been taken on, if I remember. But Europe, more generally, the continent of Europe is facing much greater pressures on this illegal migration, huge numbers coming, and you saw there was a scandal yesterday reported where the Greeks had towed a boat of people back out into the sea and just left them, and some allegations of even throwing people overboard. There's been some very aggressive turn back policies in parts of southern Europe, and even criminalizing people who go to their aid. Well, I'm afraid in our system, we're a liberal democratic country that's never going to have a policy of forcibly towing people back. If people appear on a dinghy in the middle of the English Channel, which is 20 odd miles wide, they're going to be rescued and brought here. But just the numbers in Europe are so big. We've had hundreds of thousands in recent years.
It does feel like Europe's a powder keg, and
yes,
and we even look south of the border, and the U.S. is teetering on the brink of something different and scary. And I feel like here in Canada, we are quite naive to these forces that are at play in the world. And that's the way it looks to me inside Canada. I assume it probably looks that way from the outside too.
Yeah, it does, and I mean, I think this illegal migration issue, I say, is just. I mean, I've watched the immigration debate in Canada, which is, the legal immigration issue is playing out very similar here in terms of like housing, pressure on housing, number of international students. We've taken some action on that, but I don't think you're facing the same pressure on this asylum and illegal migration stuff, which Europe. And in fairness, actually, the weird thing about this, because and there's a poll out today saying, it's the third biggest issue in this election is immigration. Actually, the numbers coming to the UK are much smaller than lots of other countries in Europe, where the pressure is much greater. But you try to tell that to the public at the moment, particularly our voters on the right. It's impossible. You can't have that debate. People say, no, they're all coming here and they're all coming for the NHS is, a common refrain. But you've seen what's happened in Europe. Look at the results in France, the rise of the AfD in Germany. There are some very, very unpleasant forces in Europe because of this failure, actually, of those of us in the liberal political class, as it were, to actually properly grapple the issue of migration.
We
I'm
relate
interested.
this.
Go
We
ahead,
relate this
Kate.
to housing, like similarly. Can we relate this to the housing and just do a bit of a comparison too on the housing discussion? And I want to actually narrow it in this case more to BC, because I'm wondering if you followed some of the BC specific, housing density policies and stuff, which feel like, I don't know, when you watch those, are they relatable to the sort of housing issue in the UK or anathema? Because we're just yeah.
I mean, they are to an extent, I think, in London, but I mean, I guess London and some major cities, you've got the similar issues going on of actually getting housing builds started, because we've got allocated land and there just hasn't been enough house building. And often, everybody says it's that classic thing, right? You talk to the electorate and they say, yes, we need more housing units because I want my kids to be able to live near me. Or to get a house, and then it's but I don't want it here.
Not here.
No, I don't mean here. No, I don't mean here. No, obviously we've got to have housing, but it needs to be somewhere else, not here. So we have that a bit. I mean, in my patch where I am up here in East Yorkshire, it's less of a problem, but in London it is. I mean, I've watched the stuff in Vancouver is just incredible, right? I mean, I remember when I worked there in my early 20s, we rented an apartment in the West End overlooking the beach. And we were doing that on kind of, minimum wage jobs. The idea now that people could do that down in Vancouver is, I've watched how it's just, and house prices, just it's incredible what's happened in Vancouver. And, I mean, how is anybody going to afford to live in Vancouver if you're on a moderate or average income?
Yeah, I mean, in between the time when you were here working, and renting that apartment and now, I'm going to guess at the time there were a lot of UK cities who would have been ahead of any city in Canada, actually, but particularly Vancouver in terms of unaffordability of real estate. And it's such a modern factor here. It's amazing how we sort of came onto the international scene in a bad way so quickly.
Is that not the case in London, though? Isn't London have the same affordability kind of crisis that Vancouver has?
Yes.
I mean, it does. I mean, London does, but London is a international city of 11 million, well, 9 million people or whatever it is, right? It's you expect it in London, New York, Tokyo. I don't think I necessarily expect. I think I'm right in saying that when I came and rented somewhere in the downtown, West End of Vancouver, I think I was paying about the same as I was paying for my student house in the UK, right? In a crappy student house, and I was getting an apartment overlooking the beach and the bay in Vancouver for a not too dissimilar amount. I mean, now that would just be fanciful, the idea that some student digs would cost the same as an apartment in Vancouver. I mean, we did introduce things here to address that over the last few years, like the Help to Buy stuff, the social housing, the affordable housing elements, which, I mean, the problem is we've also helped fuel some of the, these programs then help fuel some of the growth in house prices. But,
if you're a lower income person in London, you're probably living in the outskirts, I would imagine.
Yeah, you're living in the outskirts, but you're well connected as well there by, the advantage you do have is you probably have a better transport network. And you might get social housing, you might get in a council house, or you might get in a housing association property, which would then be obviously a lower rent, or potentially you might get a shared equity property. You could part purchase, part rent, which is what quite a lot of young professionals do.
Switching gears, we have, as you know, we have an election here in BC coming up in October. We've got a federal election next year, probably. You've contested a marginal seat in East Yorkshire. You were elected 4 times, and you managed to increase your margin, I think, each time. What was the secret of your success to win in a tough spot and increase your margin over time in areas not traditionally conservative?
Yeah, I mean, last election I got 70% of the votes. This was a Labour seat that I turned into, I think, the 13th safest Tory seat. And all our councillors are also elected from our parties here. So I've ended up with no Labour councillors elected here, even in last year when we were getting trounced nationally.
Sounds like paradise to me.
Single seat. Yeah, we sound exactly. It's freedom. We held every single seat. In fact, we had a by-election in my patch for a council 2 weeks ago, and we got the best result we'd ever got, despite the fact the polls show we're apparently going to be trounced. But I've done it locally. I've got a very good team, but the thing I've always done is local campaigning. My constituents hear from me all year round with local newsletters. Even the week before polling day, I sent out 8,000 letters to pensioners, advising them on the support that was available for them. I run a bid writing service, so I employ somebody from my constituency office to help community groups source funding. We write bids for them, to whether it's a little sports team to a family support group.
This is a good one. So community groups that don't have the sophistication to do their grant applications, they can go to your MP office and get support.
Yeah, I call it my bid writing service, because what a lot of those groups, you have these really well-meaning people in the community who want to do, like I have a really good group here called Families in Gould. They're a group of young women who want to support other families that may be struggling. But to apply for funding from a lot of these charities or wind farm funds, as we have around here, you need to have safeguarding policies in place. You need to have a bank account. You need to have a constitution. You need to be formally constituted. So my team go in and do all that paperwork with them, provide them with all the training, and then help them write the bids. Because what these bid writing processes, you need kind of middle class skills. You need to be an accountant or a professional who's used to doing that. So I just said, I'm going to set this up, and we've now raised, I think, through that, like £2.5 million for local groups, just securing funding for them. So people appreciate that, right? Because they say, look, I'm not a Tory, Andrew, but I vote for you because you've done a lot. And it's, I think politics is increasingly moving in that direction as well, right? People do not associate with a party in the way they used to. So if they think they have a good egg as their MP and somebody who's on their side, they're more willing to stick with you than otherwise, right? And people just don't have that. My great granddad was Labour, and he would have turned in his grave, and if anybody had ever voted anything but Labour, right? That's how people used to be. Or people were, you hear people say, we're a conservative family here, whatever that means. We're a conservative, we always vote conservative. Well, that's not the case anymore, right? People are open to a less aligned. So that's what I've done. And just, it's not rocket science, right? I always say to colleagues who make hard work of this, if you tell people what you're doing for them, and you're doing things and addressing things that they want you to address, well, here presto, they might vote for you again. None of this is rocket science, right? But too many, politicians get it so wrong. They go off on niche issues, or they don't communicate. So anyway, that's how I think we've done it.
So it sounds like you've built a personal brand that's separate and apart from being a conservative.
Yeah, I always run in all my literature, I've always run Andrew Percy, a strong independent voice, our local champion, because, I've kind of been independently minded. So I call my own party out. I did actually, in my first term in office, I think I voted against my own whip about 50 times. And I actually texted Cameron on the week we left, David Cameron, and said, look, you got me here in the first place because you were our leader when I won. Thank you for that. I'm sorry I turned out to be such a disappointment to you. So, he very graciously replied, saying, actually, I always respected you for that. But I wasn't, I think people want, I'm a conservative, right? Don't get me wrong. And people know that. It's no surprise, right? So,
Is the trend line, though, that there's more politicians who behave that way or fewer, right? Like, I'm trying to think, in Canada, we have Nathaniel Erskine Smith, I think, is probably one of the higher profile versions who does something similar. sort of sticks his neck out and does something else. But there aren't many I can think of right now.
Yeah, it's the big, I mean, even though the systems are identical, it is the big difference, which, you know, Canadian MPs I'm friends with are always like amazed at how much kind of voting against the whip goes on here. I mean, you know, and we've seen, and look, I vote against the whip. I always do it. I've always done it in the way of, I defend my party. I defend the government's position. I don't just, you know, pigeon drop on my party, which I'm afraid too many of my colleagues have done in recent years, which is part of the reason we're on 23% in the opinion polls. You do it on an issue and you take the issue up and you explain why. But you explain to Canadian MPs, you know, well, we often vote against our own side. That's not usual in Canada, right? Because you'll be disciplined or thrown out the party. Here, it's tolerated a lot more in the Commons that people can defy the whip, particularly on our benches, because, you know, we've become very unruly. Are we
going to pay a price for that? Like,
what's
the legacy of that? Yeah.
I think the risk is that you end up with automatons. And the line I always used to say to I was a school teacher before I did this, and the last couple of years I taught primary. And when the whip used to call me in, our chief whip, and tell me off in my early days, I used to say, but if you just need somebody who can walk through the division lobby and say their name, well, you might as well just bring my 5-year-old kids in, who I used to teach, because they know their name and they can follow a line. And I don't, you know, there's a balance, right? Because you have to have some degree of loyalty, of course, and you have to have discipline. But I think you can also have an element of, you know, the issues I rebelled on against my own party, it was me saying to my party that my party's got the right issue here, we need to address it, but I'm worried about some of the consequences of what we're doing. So let's think again. We're the only ones with the answers. The opposition don't have the answer. But, you know, you need people who are going to question from within, I think. And of course, the journalists love it, right? Because journalists always love it because they bemoan if an MP is just a loyalist who's never voted against their own party. And then as soon as you become somebody who rebels and vote against their own party, that's like, oh, now it's causing trouble. And so, you know, it's you can't win, really.
It feels like Parliament in the UK is a much more vibrant entity. Whereas in Canada and in Victoria here, the centre has so much control that they're rubber stamping.
The party leader has to sign off the nomination, of course, whereas here it's my local party who pick me. And that's key. You know, yes, if I had the whip removed, then I wouldn't be able to stand as a Conservative. But you know, even people who had their whips removed, the whip removed by Boris ahead of the 2019
Can you
election,
explain that? Because I don't think our audience understands the terminology here of when you say having the whip removed. What does that mean?
So all Conservative MPs take the Conservative whip. So that's what it's called, taking the whip. So you take the whip, and that means you're a member of the parliamentary party. If you lose the whip, then you're no longer a Conservative MP. You're not a member of the 1922.
This isn't like a horse racing reference, is it?
No, I don't think so.
It sounds like. Sorry.
The whip's office.
We would say you're thrown out of caucus. I guess it's just
thrown out of
another way to say it.
The whip's office here, they do have a whip on the wall. So I don't know where it comes from. I guess it comes from being whipped into line, right? You know, you whipped into line.
Yeah.
I mean, I am surprised. I'm surprised in Canada how backbenchers or private members don't exercise their power more, because they do have power. Like the power of dissent is actually quite impressive once it gets played out, because usually power seeks to mollify it.
Yes, well, and that's, you know, look, you don't, you know, generally what happens here if you have an issue is, you know, you get 20 or 30 of your mates who have the same issue, you go see the minister, you raise it with your whips, and then, you know, some attempt is made to deal with that, and you might be talked out of it, or they may offer an amendment or a change, or to look at. So, you know, it's, but, you know, we do get elected to Parliament to legislate, right? So we should be playing an active role in that, and not just taking the bill that comes off the shelf from the government and saying everything in here is perfect. And I mean, the thing that happens here a lot as well is when, if there's a big rebellion or trouble in the Commons, what the government will agree to do is say, look, sit on your hands, let it go here, and then we'll make the change in the Lords, because government doesn't like to give way in the Commons, but the House of Lords, because the House of Lords has no majority and it's got all these crossbenchers and they're forever voting against the government, often you'll get the change you want to the legislation in the Lords, because they just don't want the trouble in the Commons, because that's the bit that gets reported.
Another different in the second house. Yeah.
Tell us about the election. Tell us, I mean, we're
Well,
what are we, 2 weeks out, and
2 weeks out.
it's not looking good for your party. Is there any hope for the
No.
Conservatives?
Hope springs eternal. Well, all I'll say is in the 2017 election, we went into it with this massive lead, thinking we were going to return with a majority of 100 plus, and we ended up with a majority of -15. So anything can change. But there's one interesting fact. So and I think this is the problem for the Conservative Party is, and if you give you two figures, the YouGov polling here shows that Labour will probably win a majority of between 150 and 200 in the Commons. That same poll shows, I think, 49% of the public don't think Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, will be a good Prime Minister. So the same people who are going to go out and give Labour this massive majority also don't. So there's no love for the Labour Party. They have not recovered in their traditional heartlands. The problem is the public, a large percentage of the public, dislike us more at the moment. So the numbers are there, or were there, for us to have won again. But the biggest impediment to that has been the Tory party, in my view, because too many colleagues haven't given Rishi a chance. It's just been briefing and even some ministers behind the scenes. And on every issue, it's just been, so the Rwanda policy, we have a hardcore on the right who are like, it doesn't go far enough. So you need to give me exactly what I want, or I'm not voting for this, and I'm going to go out to the press and trash the government. But at the same time, we have the One Nation caucus of 100 MPs who are the moderates saying, well, if you go any further on this, you'll lose us. And the two sides don't appreciate each other. So they just have been at war with one another. So it doesn't look good at the moment. We're about 25% range. It's basically a reverse of Canada. The Liberals and Tories, those are the numbers for Labour at the moment. But there's no love for Labour. But I don't know how how do we get it back now with colleagues being the way that they have.
So the Liberal Democrats, are they gaining as a result of this, or are they just stuck in the
not
in
really?
usual place?
They're stuck in their usual place in the polls. The advantage they have is that they have an exceptional ground game in the seats. I mean, lots of people describe the way I've always campaigned here as like a Lib Dem campaign. And I cut my teeth fighting the Lib Dems in the next door seat where I used to be our political chairman, and a lot of their tactics. So they've got I think a dozen seats at the moment. Even though their poll ratings haven't improved much, they could probably snatch up to 30 or 40 seats from us in our traditional Tory territory, where more traditional, home counties, south of England Tories are just looking at us and thinking, no, they don't want to vote Labour, but they might be tempted to vote Liberal. So they could do well. I mean, the SNP is the interesting one. The SNP in Scotland look like they're going to get a bit of a pasting, with lots of their seats going to Labour. So the separatists are definitely on the decline. But there's a big, I think, a 30,000 poll out tonight showing we could be down to about 115 seats, which from 380 odd is pretty grim.
And what's the total in Parliament now? 600 and something?
650.
650.
So,
it's a big Parliament.
The polls don't look good, but yeah, I mean, population-wise, I think it's about the same electorate per MP as in Canada. But
it's interesting with those numbers so big, like bringing it back to your point about, the sort of dissent within the ranks that a party will tolerate. I mean, at those sizes, you're going to have to tolerate more dissent. Yeah. We're so small. And actually, interesting, I want to bring it back to BC, because again, then you're talking about even a smaller pool, right? You're less than 100. And I want to take it back to the root of, I'm going to call it the root of the moment we're in now on the right, when Kevin Falcon, the leader of BC United, kicked out John Rustad, and Bruce Banman, for eventually Bruce Banman. I think so. It starts with views, right? It starts with political views on climate. Is that, watching that from your perspective from the UK, were you kind of like, did that make sense to you, or did that feel like that would never happen in the politics you follow? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think Canada could give lectures on how to divide the right? I mean, you've been so good at it. I mean, whilst the Conservative Party, we always call it this broad church, we've also managed to survive and maintain being the most successful democratic political party on the planet. So we've never faced this same existential split on the right as Canada faced, with reform, and as you're seeing in BC now. I mean, there's a difference, I think, when we talk about dissent in the ranks. There's a difference between having dissent on policy and on legislation. And, those are the things where I've had issues with my party in my time here and have been prepared to put my head above the parapet. That's not what we've had in recent years, though. What we've had is personal fallouts, sniping, deliberate undermining of the government because they belong to a different camp within the party. And that kind of stuff is just not survivable. So, I mean, the kicking somebody out for having different views is, I don't think that generally doesn't end well. And I think perhaps Kevin Falcon will be realising that hasn't exactly ended well for him. But similarly, you got an election coming up, having two centre to centre-right parties on the ballot isn't going to end well for either of those parties either. So, I mean, and as I say, Canada has been down this route before, right? Been down this path before. So I follow the developments and the recent attempts but it doesn't sound like there's going to be a coming together, is there?
So, I was just going to say just about our connection between Canada and the UK. I do believe Fighting Joe Martin, who was a MLA in British Columbia in the early 1900s, went on to be an MP in the UK after his BC political career. So is, in fact, your plan to move to British Columbia, your attempt to run for office in British Columbia and serve as in the BC legislature to close off this back and forth that's been going on for a century?
I have been rumbled. This is the plan all along. I mean, I only got elected to the British Parliament so that I could eventually become the Premier of British Columbia. I mean, Fantastic. This whole 14 years has been a complete charade, and I've been figured out at long last. I mean, it's an interesting idea, right? I mean, I don't know whether you want a Premier with a Yorkshire accent. It might not work so well. I'd probably have to rename it Premier as well, because, we'd say Premier rather than Premier. So I don't know whether that would work.
W.A.C. Bennett used to refer to himself as the Prime Minister of British Columbia. So maybe you could do that.
Yeah, that could work.
I mean, if this is if it's what the people want, then, if the call came.
Who are you to disagree? If that is what the people, if the call comes, you will answer. Exactly. So what are your plans in BC? Do you have plans at this point? You're planning to move here, right?
Yeah, I mean, people keep asking me here what I'm going to be doing, and I keep telling. I mean, I've just been out in my patch today, my bits of my old patch where quite a few people came. I said, "Oh, Andrew, what are you going to be doing?" I said, "I'm going to be washing windows. That's going to be my plan. I'm going to wash windows." I tell everyone that I'm just going to wash windows to throw everybody off the scent. But yeah, I've got a few things set up. I'm going to be based out in BC and also doing bits and bobs over here, bouncing back and forth a bit because obviously I've got family and parents here and all the rest of it. So, I'll perhaps tell you more about that in person than anywhere publicly. But yeah, that's the
we just want to alert the audience that they may hear a funny Yorkshire accent on the streets.
Exactly.
Their future prime minister is on his way.
He's on his way to sort the bits and bobs. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what people want, right? That's all you need is some Brit getting off a plane and telling you what to do, right? I mean, that's going to end well.
Well, I do have to say, there's a British way of describing like tough spots or difficult areas that like reduces them to this like whimsical language, like bits and bobs that I do enjoy and could be good political communication.
The one I always like to use, which I always find the North Americans find very funny, is when something's a complete disaster, you just say, "Well, it's not ideal," as the way of
suboptimal.
It's less than perfect. It's not what I would have preferred. But no, I mean, I love BC and I follow BC politics. I'm quite intrigued by the election. Hopefully, I will be out in time to maybe play a bit of a role helping out doing some campaigning, because I am quite intrigued to see what happens with this split on the right and whether that fixes itself or whether it leads to a massive return for the NDP. It will be interesting and then what happens after that.
And what shapes after that. Yeah. Mike's talked to you through his Big Bang Theory, I hope.
It hasn't, I don't think. Oh,
Oh,
well,
okay.
is it the complete implosion of one to be replaced by another?
Yes. We're in a debate
Right.
about what stage of that we are in.
Uh-huh.
But it is a theory of Mike's that we'll have to have you back to discuss, Andrew Percy. Thank you so much for
I'd
joining us
love
today.
to anytime.
Guess, what was your best summer job as a student? I grew up in a farming community, and when I was 18, I landed a plum gig at the local canning factory. I was part of a team who came in overnight to clean the machines that canned peas, beans, corn, and other vegetables. I nearly got fired when I first started, as I was a little slower than the guys on the crew. I nearly lost an eye when I sprayed myself in the face with a power hose, and I accidentally doused myself in the bubbles of a hazardous cleaning agent designed to break down carbon-based molecules. I kept at it, and I eventually found my groove, basically becoming nocturnal that summer and carrying a distinct perfume of creamed corn. I made $7.85 an hour, which I was very happy with because it was a little bit more than minimum wage at the time. One of the best paying summer jobs a teenager with zero job experience could get at the time was tree planting. It was hard work, but if you got a system down and could endure the heat, the black flies, and spotty access to indoor plumbing, it could be a relatively lucrative summer gig. But guess, would you believe that tree planting is one of the jobs that is being revolutionized by AI? Flash Forest is a Toronto-based reforestation startup that blends AI, drones, and ecological science to plant trees quickly and on a large scale in fire-ravaged areas. They load seed pods onto drones, and from the air, they can fire around 20 seeds a second to the ground. Flash Forest has refined a recipe that can germinate even in drought conditions, and with only 2 drones, they can plant up to 75,000 trees daily in remote or unsafe places. That's good news for BC and Canada, as we've got a lot of replanting to do. Last year, flames reached record-breaking levels, burning nearly 25,000 square kilometers of land and forcing at least 33,000 people from their homes in BC alone. Flash Forest uses TELUS's world-leading networks, allowing them to operate in extremely remote areas where a lot of these wildfires take place. The fast and reliable network connectivity enables them to gather real-time data in the field and use that data to deepen their research, refine their approach, and ultimately improve tree planting success. That means more trees, which absorb and store carbon dioxide, reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, regulating precipitation, and aiding in preventing extreme environmental events. TELUS, your hometown team, through its TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good, has committed nearly $50 million in innovative startups, including Flash Forest, that are driving social and environmental change to make the world a better place.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Today we have Stepan Vdovine joining us. Welcome, Stepan.
Nice to see you guys. Thanks for having me.
You're taking Jeff's seat on the plush couch in the strategy suite. Feeling comfy?
Yeah, thanks for the friends and family rate at the hotel. Nice digs.
We're glad to have you. Stepan is no stranger to Vancouver politics, having been the engine powering Vision Vancouver during its halcyon days of 3 successive mandates under Mayor Gregor Robertson. He was also part of the Horgan Industrial Complex for a brief time, helping out in the early days of the revolution. Further, unlike most of our backroom guests on Hotel Pacifico, he's been an elected official himself, serving 2 terms as school trustee for school district number 42 in his hometown. Here it is again, Maple Ridge.
Yay.
He was and elected as a teenager too, at the time too, where I think made a relationship with a young reporter at the Globe and Mail there, potentially covering education, if I recall correctly.
Quite possibly.
We were Twitter buds, I think.
Did you pivot directly from you actually carried the momentum from a student council election straight into a school board?
Something like that. Yeah. No, okay. I was a pretty rebellious young man and felt that the best way to challenge authority is to actually have some authority. And I don't know what the voters of Maple Ridge were thinking at that time, but I did get myself elected to the Board of Education, and I feel like it was education for me for 2 terms. I enjoyed it immensely. And thanks for that introduction, by the way, because I'm not used to being introduced that way. I usually get introduced as Mira Ark's husband, which in fairness to this day remains my greatest accomplishment, but I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's see if you can accomplish anything on the strategy suite here today. Let's get right into it. BC politics. Hasn't been any public polls in a couple of weeks. Geez, what's going on here? We have nothing to talk about.
It's all quiet on the polls. The crossings seem to have
slowed down.
Stalled. Yeah,
stalled. They've
is.
abruptly stopped in the last 2 weeks.
Is this a calm before the storm, perhaps? What's the metaphor we need to use for this moment?
Or the calm before the baby?
Yeah.
The premier is expecting a new arrival to his family shortly, I understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you ask anybody on the street, I don't think anybody can remotely tell you that election is coming. So it's whatever storm people have going on in their lives, and it's the rest of us who are feeling like it's calm before the storm. But fair enough.
Fair point. I mean, I think there's also whatever's going to happen, whatever part of the Big Bang retraction expansion we're on, there's more to play out of that certainly before E-Day, and I think that's going to be something that's probably going to grab voters' attention. Maybe not now, but soon. So, okay, so we'll stick with calm before the storm, right? Stormy for voters, stormy life circumstances, everyone's struggling with affordability, people are bitter at leadership. Let's move that then because I'm wondering, I want to talk a little bit about some of what we've seen recently. Like I'm noticing a lot of the headlines right now. I want to draw a parallel to I'm probably a little bit older than you, Stefan, but New Kids on the Block were really big in the early 90s and everyone had posters on their wall and then suddenly they were not cool and you had to tear them down. And I feel for David Eby, Justin Trudeau is kind of like his New Kids on the Block. He's got to tear down all the posters and show his cred that he's not, distance himself. They seem to be using every opportunity they can to put some distance between themselves and Ottawa. Does that seem fair? Are you noticing that?
Well, it's interesting, right? That's the discussion this week, stemming from those comments the Premier has made towards Ottawa. But look, I don't think that the province ultimately needs to decouple itself from Ottawa, because I don't think it's been coupled in the first place. There's obviously clear relationships that exist that I think has been helpful to both governments, and I think Ottawa has been borrowing BC housing ideas as it struggles with its own challenges. But broadly speaking, and this goes back to the discussion you've had with your guest in the main segment earlier, there isn't that, the polls tell you there isn't that kind of a climate around time for change in BC. And so, whatever that was last week around those comments the Premier has made, it's interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see if there's more of that to come. I suspect not, but we'll see.
I don't know, Mike. I mean, there's been a couple recently. I was looking at the headlines. What was it this morning? There was a new one. Oh gosh. So there was the one on the equalization, which is kind of the table stakes for distancing yourself from Ottawa, right? So talking about joining the Newfoundland case on equalization. There was a little, it's like a soft fight, like a pillow fight on the refugee stuff where, And then, what was it? Oh, this morning, was it this morning, the headline about the CSIS Act and the Premier sort of pointing out
foreign interference.
Yeah,
we've had foreign interference on this podcast today, but oh my gosh, we're going to be investigated.
Not naming any names.
Not naming any names.
Exactly. It's okay.
Funny Yorkshire accents are fine.
Bits and bulbs.
Okay, use the analogy of the New Kids on the Block posters. Well, I can tell you that John Rustad's putting up the Taylor Swift Pierre Poilievre posters and dancing all night long on that front. So this is an election where we're actually going to see federal influence, foreign influence from the federal parties into the BC election, because the Conservatives are bringing it through the Poilievre connection all day long. They want it. They want to do that. They want to sail in his windy wake, if I can put it that way. And they want to tie the NDP to the Liberals. They want to tie Eby to Trudeau. And BC United's kind of caught in the middle in that whole conversation. But you got a Liberal MP, John Aldig, seeking a provincial NDP nomination. There has been discussion about federal Liberal voters who haven't already gone to the NDP, more of them going to the NDP, and it just kind of sets the election up as a proxy battle for the
Look,
federal.
I'll just say that I think there's something to be said for not denying that something, not coming out and denying that something exists when it doesn't, especially when I don't think the general public believes that the two entities are one and the same. I don't think you'll see David Eby and Justin Trudeau have burgers at White Spot in Coquitlam like John Horgan and Justin Trudeau had several years ago. I think that's not happening. But I think the Conservatives wish the link existed when it doesn't quite exist to the same extent that they want it to exist.
You might be fair. Like maybe it's not quite there, but they could be inoculating themselves somewhat too. And I think there's a real liability because again, I don't think that the Trudeau government borrowed from the policy playbook of the Horgan government the way they have the Eby government, and really Poilievre kind of made it inevitable because he seems to have decided that Eby is a worthy target for him, especially on some big issues like housing.
Yeah, he released an ad in the past week that features BC quite prominently. Actually, it's obviously aimed at Trudeau, but it has a lot of the BC kind of homeless images in there. So for the voter who's seen that kind of stuff, I think there's a tie-in.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You've had this discussion before about Poilievre, staking some of his ground in BC recently, and it's interesting because there's a real danger for him to put capital on this, and if the Conservatives lose provincially, what does that mean for him? So I think you'll have to watch this closely, no doubt. But to that ad, and I think this goes to the broader debate about why there's not the same level of intensity around time for change in BC, is because some of these issues that are driving federal conversation, unfortunately, have been so normalized here in BC. The housing crisis have been so acute in British Columbia for the past 10 years. The drug and opioid crisis have been here much longer and much more pronounced than they've been in the rest of the country. And so I think the voter is unfortunately, and I don't say this with any kind of pleasure, but the reality is that I think the voter has come to accept it as part of the day-to-day life, and perhaps is not quite as shocked by it as it is in the rest of the country.
Well, John Rustad will make his case later this week to the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, I believe on Thursday, 3:00. Strange time for a Board of Trade event. Over $200 for a non-member to go hear Mr. Rustad, but what do they get? Is it cheese and crackers at 3:00?
It's like really high quality cucumber sandwiches. Andrew Percy will be able to talk to us about this. It's a quality tea time. It's a quality tea time.
So I'm most interested. I'd like to hear from the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, our former guest Bridget and David Van Hemmen, what the menu will be. I'm not planning to attend, but I'm very concerned for the guests who are attending. But the question is, what will Mr. Rustad serve up to that crowd? Is this his moment, I wonder, to make his case that just enough with BC United, you got to go all in with me?
The right moment to make that case, don't you think, after this week Kevin Falcon had with the unforced error of the Surrey North candidate?
Well, I was going to start the rumor because the 12 o'clock slot is reserved for Bob Branny, who is doing a big lunch on at the Urban Development Institute for his 50th anniversary of real estate career. So while John Rustad may be ahead of Kevin Falcon, it's Bob Rennie that takes the lunch slot. So but that's where the business community is going.
They could have just played the YouTube of our podcast and done that instead with Bob.
Well, while we're talking, talking
BC,
about,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, talking about business community, do you want to move? We have a clipping this week. We have a clipping, and it's Kirk LaPointe writing about Hotel Pacifico guests and former premiers Christy Clark and Glenn Clark on the prescriptions they shared for the economy at a BC summit earlier this month. Glenn's advice. Kirk is picking apart Glenn's advice to focus on wealth creation rather than wealth distribution, which he calls laughable because, quote, asking social democrats to generate growth can be like asking a fish to skate. Shots fired. And then also not too much time for Christie's advice, which is unite the right. He calls that a prescription that's of no use with such unwilling patients. So, I mean, I'm just gonna say, like, there's a little bit of, I really enjoyed this clip, and I have a little bit of like, okay, boomer, like way to double down on the angry grump and the generalizations. But let's talk about here, because I think underneath this, he's making a point about who has the chops to actually build out the BC economy. And we've talked about this with other guests, right? Where we've talked about sort of the policy framework you need to really build out, how economic policy actually takes a lot of in-depth knowledge of the sort of different parts of the economy you need to drive. It's not pushing your pedal, one pedal or another. Stefan, I want to get you to react in particular. Is asking a social democrat to generate growth like asking a fish to skate?
Yeah. You know, Kirk LaPointe and I have some history together, but look, like I'll just say this, just to stay within the confines of a space you've created that's respectful and you know, encourage and uplift and debate. Look, like if look no further than real estate, which continues to be the driving contributor to the GDP in this province, and look at what the government has done when it comes to housing policy, and talk to development community, and you'll hear that the government policies have been the most advanced policies that encourage an economic activity when it comes to real estate sector. So, you know, I know Kirk is writing to a certain audience, and that's fine. But the reality is that as you say, Kate, I think the reality on the ground is very different. And I'm not sure those attitudes that certain folks try to go back to the 90s and the rest of it, I don't know how much saliency that has today.
But Kirk's reporting what Glenn said, and Glenn is calling for government to put more focus on wealth creation. And then he's speaking probably more from the natural resources side.
Yep.
And he's on the board of Canfor. He'd have a window into that. He's on the board of he's probably on the board of West Shore Terminals too, and which is shipping you know, stuff. But Glenn's come out with a perspective.
Glenn's come out with a perspective. I think he's made some comments around the forestry sector and policies that relate to that. I don't pretend to be an expert on that, but you know, Kirk has given it a spin, right? So yeah. Let's be honest about it.
Okay, fine. Kirk's given it a spin, but let's talk about Glenn.
I'm not taking the bite.
Because we love to talk about Glenn. I'll talk about Glenn all day long. But to me, it seems like Glenn represents a certain part of the NDP that has always been more focused on the economics. Now, when he was premier in the 90s, he took a lot of heat for not being able to deliver a strong economy. Mm-hmm. But here he is today as coming off a distinguished business career, and he's saying we got to put more focus on, you know, baking a bigger pie that everyone can share in, as opposed to just figuring out how to carve up pieces of a diminishing pie. Is that a political concern for the NDP that former premier is voicing that? Is that going to cause any? Is there a nagging concern coming out of the deficit and coming out of just a feeling of economic stagnancy right this moment? Or maybe you don't share that view.
Yeah. By the standards of discourse you discussed with your previous guest around, you know, party members towing party line, I think Glenn's comments are pretty timid, you know, in a fair game, because he has an expertise that the rest of us don't have. And look, not all government policy is perfect at all times, and that debate has to continue. But you know, I think Glenn's made respectful comments. I'm not. You know, I don't think it's even within the confines of a polite Canadian conversation, I don't think Glenn's comments rise to a level of any concern. I don't think he's expressed any doubt in government's competency when it comes to the economic file. And as I said a moment ago, I think the general public agrees, because the conversation in this country around what's important has been redefined so much in the last 10 years, you know, certainly federally around deficits. Now, we'll see if that persists, and we'll see if the pendulum swings into the opposite direction, but we haven't seen it so far.
Well, I think, isn't there an important distinction too in, like, Glenn is critiquing his team, and offering, you know, a change in tack. He's not necessarily saying, and then these guys over here have got the recipe and they're clearly going to do it. It's interesting. And this is I think the kind of flaw in the piece. It's Kirk LaPointe saying that and making this broad generalization that progressives can't do economy. And then by assumption, by their more right-leaning proclivities, he's not specific. I guess we'll lump them in. He's saying BC United and the BC Conservatives can. And I think it undermines a really important point about like what, and I think there was a really good setup by the director of policy for BC about the state of BC's economy and where we need to grow. And my point is, I think it just underserves that there is a really good discussion to be had about how to bring growth and more growth to BC. And if you didn't read the piece, or if you haven't read the piece, listeners, I think good to note, if you rank Canadian provinces and US states in terms of productivity and GDP, I think BC was like, where was it? It's like next to Kentucky near the bottom of the list. So there's obviously improvement here, but it's not about right and left.
Don't think the NDP,
it's not that.
I don't think the NDP spent a lot of time talking about economic growth and they don't spend a lot of time putting that in the window. And heading into an election, I probably would, if I were them, at least empathize with industries that are suffering and where's, you know, who's the Don right in this government in terms of the economic czar of the government? Is it coming out of Jedi? Is it coming out of other places in government? It's not altogether clear. Is there a minister who has that kind of putting the stamp on the economy? That's not really clear to me either. So I think it's as much a political communication issue as well as an issue of substance.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll go back to the fact that, look, productivity within that debate about where Canada is and different provinces are, it's a legitimate debate. There's no question about it, but it's not a debate that's happening at the dinner table. And I think for the government to enter that debate with, you know, wonky policies, they should probably do that for the right reasons, but not for political reasons. There's no question about that.
All right. Yeah. Let's move this then too, because this is a multimedia edition of the Strategy Suite, and I do want to turn our attention to a clip some of our listeners may have caught on YouTube, courtesy the Green Caucus.
Another beautiful day at the legislature. Out here, I'm one of the good guys, but there aren't that many good guys left. Sonia first now. I'm a legislator.
I was told you were the one to call, Sonia. It's bad. No other politician will touch it.
The old growth, the salmon, they're in trouble.
Are you scared?
The truth is more important. The people of BC, they need us.
Everyone here has secrets.
You always said they treat this province like a resource colony.
Okay, great. So listeners...
I do love the soundtrack.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, let's just set it up, because some folks will be watching on YouTube, some will be listening. So just good to know the voices you heard were Green Leader, Sonia Firstino, Adam Olsen, and then there was a cameo by David Suzuki in there briefly. I have to totally agree, Mike. Like the soundtrack and Sonia Firstino's like gritty, smoky voice, like no notes,
the
perfection. The hat, so good.
I'm going to award a Hotel Pacifico Oscar to the cinematographer.
Yeah,
and for sound.
Yeah.
This is such an unconventional video, though. Can we pause?
Yeah.
Well, here's what here's what I noticed, and then we'll go around the horn.
Okay.
Is that the fact that Suzuki was in it? I thought it was kind of interesting. Just because he's thrown a little bone to the Greens, and Suzuki's always been, he's been all over the place politically on the left, but he carries a lot of weight. The thing is that I don't think this video is getting a lot of amplification, so it's not like actual voters are going to see this. I think it's living in Twitter.
It
largely
needs to be brought out of the shadows.
But you know what? Props to Sonia and her team for just doing something a little different and I'll obviously won't agree with the content of the video as it unfolds in the its entirety for the next couple, if people go and choose to watch the end of it, but I appreciate the effort.
Stefan?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think when you're not part of a conversation, it's always admirable to see political parties try tactics that perhaps will put them back into the conversation. It's harder to do that when you're competing at a different level. Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to put them back into any kind of a conversation. As Mike says, it's got 408 views this morning, and I don't think there's a Facebook or a YouTube buy that's involved with this. And you've got to wait for 2 minutes before you realize what this is all about, which I think is at the end of the day, as far as concerns go, a pretty marginal issue.
Yeah, it's fairly long. It's over 2 minutes, and you spend a lot of it. I mean, I'm just nerdy enough to stick with it and enjoy sort of the costumes and the voiceover and the music. But you have to stick with it a while before you understand the point.
What you say, there's hardly any good guys left. Yeah, because Weaver left. Weaver, they were 3, and now they're 2, and then they couldn't get anybody else elected, and they might be down to 1 after the next election or less. So that's like, you haven't been that successful. That's why.
But as a political tactic, it comes out of nowhere, and it has nothing following it. It's just out there on its own for 2 minutes in midweek in June, and everyone's moved on.
Yeah.
Well, I will still give them props for better than nothing.
Yeah, it gets Hotel Pacifico. I'm trying to think of what's the analogy of an Oscar-winning film that nobody saw.
Mike, I just want to say there's no chance to replay 2017. Like, no amount of awards to the Greens now is going to correct that record.
No, Sonia broke my heart once before, but I'm a big enough person that I can give her a shout out for meaningless videos.
Fantastic. All right. And time for a drink now?
I want to get personal and share my family's energy story. Black thermal coal. Over a century ago, my grandmother's family mined it under the Atlantic seabed off of Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. Some moved west to apply their skills to underground mining in Drumheller. That's where my grandparents met. There were dozens of coal mines in the Badlands, and my grandfather had the high-grade mine and the Rose Deer mine. Coal was how millions of Canadians heated their homes for generations. And when my mother was growing up in Vancouver, her home was heated by sawdust. Vancouver would have smog thicker than pea soup in the 1940s because of sawdust burning in households across the region. When I was a kid, our home in Haney, find that on a map, was heated by oil. The big oil truck used to come to our house to fill up our massive oil tank. When I was a high school kid, the gas network was extended to my neighborhood and our heating became a lot cleaner. Today, I lean on both gas and electricity for home heating. Fortis BC also has deep roots when it comes to energy in our communities. Their first hydroelectric dam was built near Nelson in 1897, and Fortis BC's Tilbury LNG facility has been safely operating in Delta for more than 50 years, storing energy for when our province needs it most. Today, gas infrastructure connects over 1 million homes and businesses throughout BC. And like the shift from coal to heating oil to natural gas, our province's energy system continues to change. Fortis BC is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by transitioning away from delivering conventional natural gas to delivering renewable and low-carbon gas. Gas, along with electricity, is an integral part of a diversified energy system. Thanks to Fortis BC for letting me share my family's energy story. What's yours? Fortis BC. Energy for a better future and a better podcast.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Did you bring a shot or did you bring a glass? Yeah.
Well, I'll start with a glass because I was raised in a polite household, and I want to raise a glass to the hosts because, as others have said, you've created a wonderful platform for civilized discussion in the province on these issues, and I think that's really wonderful and admirable, and I think we need more of that in today's day and age. But I think my shots are probably more juicy and more interesting. Let me
You're
first take
welcome,
a
though.
shot. Yeah, if I can, I'll take a shot at the University of Victoria for how they handled the very tragic event relating to the death of a student resulting from the opioid death. And not only that, but to have to watch them being dragged, kicking and screaming in their response to do the right thing. It's unconscionable. I think it's really regretful, and I think accountability is yet to come, and I think the public expects that, and I think we should expect more from our public institutions.
Thanks for that one. Yeah. Mike.
I am going to take a shot at the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm going right to the top today.
All right.
On an issue that is absolutely means nothing to the people of British Columbia. And that is British Columbia will soon have 2 vacant Senate seats. And I think this is wrong. I am offended that we would have vacant Senate seats there where BC's voice cannot be properly heard in the Parliament of Canada. Moreover, I am also offended that the manner in which they're selecting the senators is we end up basically as a bunch of people who have no connection to anybody democratically recommend names that are eventually chosen, and they sit not with political parties but as independents. And I think, what is going on with our institutions where we have a system where there's no connection to at least our political parties, which have some democratic connection. So, but I will say this, being that as it may, any British Columbian can apply to be a senator. So I am going to appoint myself as a headhunter for the Senate, and I am going to go identify some senators and get them to apply.
Yes.
Because we should have some good senators.
Agreed.
And senators who actually know something about politics would be good. That's like in this audience, I think there's probably a few senators in there I can suspect. I will not be applying. I want to make that perfectly clear.
Okay.
But I have a podcast to run.
And that's not what Jeff's off doing? Jeff's not off writing his application?
Well, Jeff's too old to be a senator.
I was going to say both of you must be approaching that.
No, Jeff's probably got a few years left in him. You age out at 75.
Yeah.
So, at least if we get a 70-year-old, they're only going to be there for 5 years. So that's good. We don't want a 35-year-old, that's for sure. Anyways, that's my shot.
The worst 35-year-old.
So I will be appointing myself as the headhunter to the Senate, and I look forward to people getting in touch with me, and I will vet your resumes.
Fantastic. All right. I am going to raise a glass, finish up on a positive note. I'm going to raise a glass that takes us back to Stefan's roots as a school board trustee. In particular, I want to raise a glass to Patty Backus, the former chair of the VSB, who used the most perfect use of the term nothing burger I have ever heard in application to the cell phone ban in schools. Now, I'm going to say the politics of this are a bit different, but it is true in practice. Like, this ban of cell phones, it means bubkiss and is going to mean bubkiss. And it is exactly a nothing burger. Thank you, Patty Backus for naming that.
So you're pro cell phone in schools?
It's not that I'm not at all pro cell phone, and I would have it noted that none of my children do not have cell phones and won't for a long time. But the idea that when we ban it in schools, it actually somehow changes behavior or anything, kids will get them into the school if they need to. Parents, in some cases, actually badly need their children to have it. And the kind of overarching ban just doesn't work, because in any case, it's always going to be a bit case by case, classroom by classroom, grade by grade. So it's a nothing burger.
Just don't ban Apple AirTags. So
I can track my kid. Fair. Don't ban those. Supportive.
Track my wife as well.
All right.
Oh boy.
Do you really have an AirTag?
This is deteriorating
No.
very quickly.
We have to get Stefan. We have to free her. We have to get the AirTag off. This is not okay.
Don't worry.
All right. She's okay.
I think it'll be fine.
All right. That is another episode of Hotel Pacifico. I'd like to thank our guest, Andrew Percy, for joining us. And I'd like to thank our strategy suite guest, Stefan Vdovine.
Oh, that's just so wrong. That's just so wrong. Like,
I'll have to come back so you can practice.
oh my
Vdovine.
God.
Vdovine.
From Eskimo.
I don't know it. It's like shit. It's like I Frenchify everything. Anyway, thank you for joining us, Stefan. And thank you to our, glad to have you. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and to Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.